I am tired. I'm ready for pleasure.
Hello, everyone. Woo! Hello. Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for coming to Flyleaf Books to hear Marcia E. Herman-Giddens talk about her new book, Unloose My Heart. She's joined by PJ MacAlpine. And just FYI, we are gonna get more copies in the next week or so. So if you'd like to claim one of those, just go up to the front desk after the event is over. Marcia spent her career years in North Carolina in the areas of medicine, public health, research, scientific writing, and advocacy, primarily involving children. Her scientific papers have been published in numerous medical journals and books. And fun fact, this is her debut book. PJ is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Army. She's a writer, a musician, and a performer. Her work explores the role of the historical past on present-day lived experiences and its effects in society. Again, thank you so much for coming to Flyleaf Books.
Wow, thank you, everyone. She's done a wonderful job. I'm going to stand up for a little bit. Cousin PJ, special cousins here, the Lanois, other cousins are here too. A lot of cousins, actually. There are more cousins coming up all the time. And I just met a few new ones now, tonight. It's a bit overwhelming, as you can imagine, especially since I've never done this before. And I'm just astounded to see all the people, so many people that is here that I know and love, and people that I haven't seen for a long time. And I'm already feeling tears. And my son Marcus, by the way, Marcus, where are you? I told Marcus I was afraid I'd cry because I cry easily. He said, bring a handkerchief. I said, well, maybe I'll bring a handkerchief. And he said, no, bring 3. So I did. And one's for you. Just in case. Just in case you need it. I want to thank Flyleaf, of course, for them to have this event. And my editor, who's not here, Claire Lewis Evans at the University of Alabama Press, who wouldn't, she was quite necessary. So many people are here that made the book possible. The Gentrys that are sitting over there from Louisiana, that you'll hear more about them. I won't go into detail now. And these other cousins, my cousin Marion, who's here, she's all through the book. We're first cousins, Marion and I. Our mothers were sisters. My book club, they're members of the book club here. I learned a lot from them. And my children's father, who's, here he is here sitting with our son. And then I'd like to thank Randy Markowitz. Randy, are you here? I haven't seen her. She was going to come, but she must not be here. And everyone else and all of you for coming. And I'm going to just go, and PJ, the bookstore said, is anybody you'd like to have on the stage with you? And I said, oh, I immediately thought of my cousin PJ here, because we actually met before I started writing the book, but she was such a part of the book, as so many people that are here. So we're going to be back and forth a little bit, and I don't know what else to say except that anybody that knows me knows that I love adventures. And writing this book, here, I feel it starting. And by the way, my voice has been a little iffy today, and she made me a wonderful tea to sip and so forth. So, in researching and writing this book has been probably the biggest, well, for sure the biggest adventure in my life, and one of the greatest privileges to be able to devote. It was kind of lucky. It was during the pandemic, partly, so that there was time for that. So I'm going to just launch right into the first reading, and then after a couple, we'll see if I make this go the right way. There we go. We'll stop and we'll talk a little bit about why I was inspired to write this book. Can everyone hear? Well, okay, great. So this is the Birmingham I knew. Scott will well remember the smog. I grew up breathing this stuff, and I actually lived in the fore part that you can't see. Birmingham is a long valley. Most people don't realize it's pretty mountainous. It's in the end of the Appalachian chain. And this city itself is kind of in this long, long valley, which was one reason that we could sometimes actually hear the bombs that the Klan was setting off, because the way the sound traveled down the valley. And the steel mills were making all the pollution. So that's how it often looked, and that's one of the two big Jewish temples. That's Temple Bethel in the foreground there. So the first thing I'm going to read to you is the very beginning of the book, the first paragraph in the preface. We went searching for our maid Jessie, who had gone missing. At home, her presence made me feel safe. Her strong brown hands glowed with a comforting warmth. The door we stood before tentatively opened, and a frightened, dark face peered out from the dim light inside. I clutched my father's hand tighter. That is how I learned in Jim Crow Birmingham there was black fear, and it swam in the streams of white fear. I was 10 years old. And the next section I want to read is from chapter 2, called Moving to Birmingham. I am a white girl of Jim Crow Birmingham, and yes, echoes of bombings still whisper in the deep crannies of my mind. My parents and I moved there in 1946. The city was thick with Jim Crow, thicker even than its smog. I didn't know what Jim Crow represented when I first arrived, and how it would weigh on me and change the course of my early life. Often, I had to go downtown alone to swimming lessons, taking the bus, even though I was only 6 years old. My parents did not buy a car until I was 10, so we depended on buses, our feet, and for me, a bicycle. Between my mother's criticism of Jews and my having to learn the curious requirement to board buses only through the front door and sit in the front, I soon realized there were rules about what sort of people one was supposed to be like and to be like. I don't remember being aware of African American people as being any different when we lived in New York. Birmingham taught me differently. To board a bus, Black people had to climb up the front steps, pay their fare, turn around, go back down the steps to the back door, and climb steps again. The top of the seats had 2 holes to accommodate pegs. There's a picture of this. That would hold signs that were lettered white on one side and colored on the other. They were moved to accommodate the changing proportions of passengers. Sometimes I would be in the white section, surrounded by empty seats, and watch the Black people crowded into the smaller area in the back, behind the colored sign. I felt uncomfortable and confused. It was against the unspoken rules for Black people to move a sign. That's the end of that section. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what pushed me to write this book. And I know those of you that are way back there can probably not see this slide at all. And I must mention my dear husband who's sitting by my cousin here, which I realized I forgot to introduce, basically. That bird right there. So some of you can probably make out that that plaque, it's at a graveyard on the slide, that at the top it says Robert MacAlpine, buried here in 1852. And he was thought, and Simon Legree, which most of you probably know who that is, the figure in Uncle Tom's Cabin who was so cruel. He was thought by many to have been a possible model for Harriet Beecher Stowe when she wrote her Uncle Tom's Cabin book. And the Gentrys over here are the ones I met because of the internet in doing this research. And Robert Gentry, you want to raise your hand? He 50, 60 years ago now, isn't it? 60 years ago, spent a lot of time researching this issue. And it was just incredible. It's too long a story. We don't have enough time, but there's more about it in the book. And then my older son and I went down there, and he and his wife Laurie helped us, and it just helped so much. And that's what really got me. I'll just put it crudely, like you can. It got me off my rear end. I had been thinking for so long about wanting to write down Scott's and my experiences in Birmingham during civil rights, and just because we became active because of the Unitarian Church, or with the Unitarian Church. I've been wanting to write those down for my children, and I kept putting it off. I'd start a little bit of writing, putting it off, and then other things happened, and I had always also been, I grew up, unlike many people that discover their ancestors had been enslavers, I grew up knowing that. So I didn't realize how much that was haunting me. And the story is in the book. Again, it's not time to tell it all. But Christmas night of 2017, and I had already met PJ and her son because of DNA matching. I was looking up that Robert MacAlpine we are connected through the MacAlpines, PJ and I. Just because I was sick, actually, I was playing with my computer, and up popped an article from the Washington Post that had this story about my third great-granduncle being a model for Simon Legree. Wow. And I broke out in chills and just thought, okay, I have to go ahead and do this. So that kind of really gave me my impetus. And then there were a lot of other wonderful things that happened, so many coincidences and serendipities and so forth that just amazing. I told PJ and she and I have talked about it a lot, that it seemed like it was supposed to happen because so many amazing things came together, such as the story with the Gentrys that you've heard, and you'll hear more about how we met and so forth in a bit. Can you think of anything else? Did I leave something out? It's hard.
I think you covered it, yes, very well.
And of course, the names, I know you can't see it, and those of you that haven't seen the book is dedicated to my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and to the names of all of the enslaved people I could find that my ancestors had held, and many more that I couldn't find. And I was telling PJ, because I've continued some of this research, and since it was too late to put any more in the book, I've found 40 more names already. Now, PJ, we're both going to try to explain this. I know you can't see this family tree, but you might be able to make out the MacAlpine sign that's down in the corner. When I was a child, Marion's mother, my cousin Marion, created these amazing genealogy books for all her siblings, and she did a lot of research, and it was pretty accurate. I don't know how she did it. It was before Marion was born, or myself. And in the book was a picture of this MacAlpine coat of arms, and it fascinated me when I was a child. I looked at it over and over and over again, and I dreamed about or thought about them. It seemed so. The Scottish, having their battles and whatnot, it just intrigued me. And how could I have known, years later I would find out that I have MacAlpine cousins. I have white cousins and black cousins, MacAlpine cousins. So the MacAlpine line went, it's through my mother's father, and then his father. And then his father's father married a woman who was a MacAlpine. And one of the things I found in all my research that, because all the lines came over very early, some earlier than others, is that with one exception, virtually every one of my great-great-grandparents on had been enslavers. So that was one of the hard things to learn. And you help me if I leave stuff out. So now, this PJ's going to try to explain, this is how we're related, and she's going to explain this.
So my father was born in Birmingham, Alabama. His mother was born in Canada, and some of her children were born in Alabama, and some of their children were born in Canada. And I always say that I understand that they had a kind of an interesting rocky relationship, and I always say, well, I guess when she got mad at him, she's like, I'm going home to mom's, who was in Canada. So, but my father was born in Alabama, as were several of his siblings. And his father was Francis Percy MacAlpine, and he was born in 1866. My grandfather was born 100 years before I was, and he was born actually in Forkland Green, and he moved to Birmingham as a young man because Birmingham was the big booming town. And at that time, it was very lucrative. It was a place for education, people that were teachers, people that were in the church, which the church and the teachers were kind of one union there in that community. His background was that his mother was named Jane, right? Jane MacAlpine, but she was often listed as just Jane early on. And as you see, he's born after the Emancipation Proclamation, but he had some older siblings that were born prior to that. And his mother was about 17, 18 years old, for the records, when she gave birth to Francis, right? So Jane was actually an enslaved woman who lived there in Forkland Green, right? In the residence of the MacAlpine, Jefferson Carruthers MacAlpine. It is believed that, and the DNA supports that Jefferson Carruthers MacAlpine, or else perhaps it could have been one of his sons that did it, but Francis always listed on his marriage certificate that his father was Jefferson MacAlpine and his mother was Jane, right? So I had grown up hearing that story, right? Because we hear stories about different things like that. And I also have friends that were like, well, I was told this, and I found out that, you know what, that's not my dad, or that's not my mom, or my sister. It happened. So I understood the genealogy, right? But being part of something we have in common, being part of the technical part of scientist, I was like, well, the DNA is really coming forward, so let's see what we have this. And lo and behold, there it is. So yes, that is Francis, that is my grandfather. I never met the man, but his legacy and others like him still echoes in Alabama, even though people have forgotten their names. He had a bookstore, Mixon MacAlpine bookstore. He had one of the few black newspapers in Birmingham, Alabama. But it was decided that he and his wife would leave. And I was told by my family, other people outside of the family that felt they could tell a story, that they left because they wanted better education opportunities for their children. So let's just talk about that for a moment. He went to the normal school, right? He knew Reverend MacAlpine, which that particular MacAlpine may or not be related, but he was a senior, a very famous minister who was promoting education in the community. And very much he was really, really wanting to go further with his education, almost to the point when I saw some of his older letters that his younger siblings kind of didn't want him to leave Forkland Green, right? Because he was in a position of being an elder sibling. And even his mother, who did support him, didn't really want him to go. She missed her son. And what he was endeavoring to do, when you think about it, was a dynamic thing. And definitely this woman is a dynamo, so I can see why we relate. So long story short, they ended up going there. His mother, Jane, died at 38 years old, right? His father had died previous to that, which he mentions in the book, but his mother was the one who cared for him. She was active in the community. I have her listed in many freedmen's records as she did marry, but she also, in her house, housed other areas where the freedmen could be married. So she was kind of a beacon in her short life to that community. But I believe that reading some of the things in his papers, such as we really need to challenge what it means to be in a political party. We need to take our place and be active in our political and financial futures and to be one amongst the people that are American. And his rebuttals to people answering, his things like, I don't really appreciate you saying that. I don't think, I don't think these colored folk need to be wanting that. He decided to leave when I find out because it was beginning to get dangerous for him. And his wife, Mary Matilda Winslow, who was the first female graduate of New Brunswick, she had children with him. They had several children, and it's a scary time. One child, Gretchen, died in Birmingham in infancy, but the other children, there was pressure on him to leave. And reading his work, I feel that he was torn, right? Because there was a legacy that he was part of, that he was building, right? That I don't feel like he ever felt like he had the momentum in that because he was the ground front runner. To go for that situation and to move to a place like Hartford, Connecticut, where they lived, along Meadow, Massachusetts, where they lived, and then settling in Springfield, where I was born, it was a change because I think he was used to fighting racism in a more confrontational manner. I don't mean in the violence, I mean seeing it head on. I mean seeing the destruction of what was built, rather than a kind of intimate, kind of more a polite and reserved form of racism that he encountered, right? That was a very different thing for him. So that's Francis's story, and that's how Marcia and I are related.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yeah, my fourth great grandfather was the older brother of her, let's see, his younger brother Solomon was, you can see there was, Jane Jefferson Carruthers MacAlpine was an enslaved person by Solomon Jr. And so it just comes down, and it's really unusual to be able, of course, to know the lineage so well. And it was really because she knew it when we discovered each other on DNA. So here's a little bit about, because people are always asking me when and how did I learn that I have African American cousins. And I was talking to PJ about it earlier today, and I just, my memory, I don't have the best memory, and I don't know. I know I didn't grow up knowing I did, because the message in our family, which cousin Marion can attest to, was yes, they were proud. My ancestors were proud that they were slaveholders, and it was fine because they were kind and good and treated the slave people well and all that sort of thing. And they would have certainly, the men would have certainly never, ever raped one of the female slaves. So I possibly bought into that, and growing up, probably, especially when I was younger, I was a young adult, I wouldn't have, I think I did buy into it. So I just kind of went through a lot of life, I think, assuming that I did not have black cousins. So I got my DNA done on Ancestry in 2016, and I very soon, discovered, and I put this, I don't have a pointer, I'm used to, the part on this side is, some of you probably have Ancestry memberships and know that the screen brings up names. You'll see a better example on the next slide. And some people post their pictures, some people don't. So I'm immediately seeing some African-American faces that were cousins. I think, oh, okay. Yes, this makes sense. When I think about it further, it makes perfect sense. And then the other way people know is, if you see that map over there with the yellow part, the countries in Africa, is if people haven't posted their picture, which I haven't been too lazy, I haven't posted mine myself, you can look at the ethnicity, which is why a lot of people get their DNA done. They're not interested in genealogy or relatives, they're just interested in what pieces they have from whatever, countries and ethnic groups around the world. So people that don't have the picture, if they've got African American blood, the sub-Saharan African countries show up. So that's the other way you know. So the picture at the stock exchange, you will soon understand that, because the next piece I would like to read to you, and I'm having to leave out the section about meeting PJ's son, the same episode visit to New York City, but just because of time. So PJ and I had arranged to meet for a cup of coffee. This was after I had email contact and we gradually developed a relationship, but we had never met in person. And PJ MacAlpine and I had arranged to meet for a cup of coffee on my first morning in the city. Our meeting spot was in a crowded restaurant on the corner of 34th Street and 7th Avenue. By design, I had worn a red coat so she could spot me. I was anxious and apprehensive, given how we were related. While I waited for her, it seemed the steam from my coffee was mimicking the cacophony of expectations swirling in my mind as they finally settled into musing about her singing. I had found a photo of her online at the microphone, her powerful, confident face thrown back in song. Halfway through my first cup of coffee, I spotted her bouncing through the cafe door. This was 2019, by the way. We gave each other a sliver of a tentative hug. How could I have known that I would hear her sing at the end of a most unusual day in a most unusual setting? That's the setting. When parting time came, I hear PJ asking me if I have ever been inside the New York Stock Exchange. I have not. It turns out until the previous week, she had worked there. We stay for the 4 o'clock bell ringing ceremony, which marks the market's daily closing. We were about to leave, and she suddenly says, "Wait, I want to sing for you." And there I am, PJ's back against the exchange's marble walls, oblivious to the cleaning people that were sweeping papers from the floor, listening to Bonnie, Annie, Laurie being sung in the clearest, sweetest voice with the most beautiful vibrato I had ever heard. Suddenly, I was in a magic land with a flock of canaries, our ancestors' plantations far behind, and the enslaved Jane is somewhere listening. It is a thing of poetry to perceive the hard and ugly past and the healing grace these cousins have brought. Now, thank you. Now, this is the next wonderful story about these cousins. This is about Kathy Lanois, who's sitting right here. And by the way, happy birthday to Kathy. She just turned 94. Wow. This, you might see a little bit better, is what a screen shows looks like on Ancestry. And for 2 years, it had been Cousin Marion when she got hers done, and a couple other close cousins, and close cousins once removed. And one day I opened it up, and all of a sudden there's this name, Kathy Lanois, right under all my close cousins. And I'm like, who in the hell is that? So I start looking and searching, and it's a long, long story. It's in the book, and there's much more that needs to be done because there's still a lot we don't know. So it turned out that I hope you don't mind, I give away the secret, maybe you don't know it. She is the only person by that name in the entire United States, or was in 2018. So it wasn't hard to find her. Did you guys ever hear about that? So I found her phone number, her address, called, of course, everybody Googles online. I think I learned that she was not a young person. And so I figured she probably wasn't doing computers. And I couldn't get her on the phone, so finally I wrote a note. I didn't hear anything. Months went by. I wrote another note. I don't think I wrote 3, but I wrote 2 because I wanted to make contact because I couldn't figure this out. It was keeping me awake at night. It cost me a lot of sleep. And I had given up. I really had. It was about 8 months had gone by, and I was on a trip with what are those, Marianne, you just went with those people. Rose Scholar. Yeah, Rose Scholar, thank you. To see the Grand Canyon, because believe it or not, I've traveled around the world, but I had never seen the Grand Canyon, and I thought I better get there before I die. And we were about to leave. We were on the North Rim, and I was standing waiting to get on the bus, and could literally see the part of the Grand Canyon, and my cell phone rings. It was 8:30 in the morning. And this voice says, "Hello, dear. This is your cousin." It was just astonishing. So that's how, and then after 3 years of intense research, many genealogists, a long story that is not all in the book, it finally is, the reason she's such a close relative, showed up so close, is she is my half first cousin once removed. So, sorry, we don't have time for the rest of that story. So I'd like to read a little bit about meeting her, and I don't think I met Richard that day.
I have one thing to add.
Yes, okay.
Remember I told you that she was a dynamo? Also a dynamo.
Yeah. That's in here, but not that word. The day after meeting PJ, I took a taxi to the apartment of my other new cousin, Kathy Lanois. After all, she had invited me on the phone. Here we, strangers. She said she was having a 90th birthday party, and she invited me to the party. So I said, after all, I had a 90th birthday party to attend. She welcomed me with a warm hug, as though she had known me for years. She lives alone with her children nearby. She's a feisty and firm woman who knows what she wants and doesn't hold back in her opinions. In spite of this, she calls everyone dear, I love, or darling. Her 4 grandchildren call her Mamir. Her smile is quick and bright, her face round with full cheeks, her hair gray and curly, her skin the color of caramel, and her personality just as sticky and stubborn. She is not a complainer. She tells me life must be taken and embraced as it is, tragedies and challenges notwithstanding. Her daughter, Evelyn Lanois, arriving soon after I did, was as warm and friendly as her mother. We immediately started discussing how we might be related. We both plied Kathy with questions. No matter how many questions we asked, her mysterious father, who we knew was how we were linked, tell by matches on Ancestry, remained elusive. Kathy is the youngest of at least 42 known children, and the last one alive. She was born and grew up in the Grand Turks. And thank you for coming again. It was something I hadn't expected, that they would come all the way down. So now, since we're in North Carolina, I thought, oops, that was for the 90th party, yes. Yeah. And it was a light snow. We walked, the party was just down the street from her apartment, and it was a little bit north of Central Park, and I ended up being the one that walked her. We walked through a light snow, do you remember that? To get to the party. And we were early, it hadn't started yet. And the other picture is one of the funnest things I've done in my life is to introduce PJ to the Lanois, because we're all related, but they didn't know that, and they had never met each other. Wow. And that was this past summer when I went there and we did that. So now changing to North Carolina, since I have picked the readings, as you can tell, because of who's here and where we are. So I figured I better talk about Harmony Hall a little bit in Bladen County, North Carolina. It's across the river from the little town Tar Heel and a little bit down from Fayetteville, near the Cape Fear. And so this house, which obviously has been restored, was built by my 4th Richardson great-grandparents, James and Elizabeth, about 1770. James was a colonel in the American Revolution. And that was another story that I grew up with, that my family was very, very proud of this house and the stories that go with it. So Harmony Hall is an ancestral home from which sprang stories of intrigue and heroism, a missing sword, land grants from the King of England, spying, faithful slaves, and war heroes. I grew up hearing these stories, and they clung to me too. My mother would take me occasionally to see the ancient house. Stories have been emanating from Harmony Hall, where it has stood in Bladen County for almost 250 years, remarkably in one piece. They have been passed down one way or another, overheard whispers slipping through loose boards, tales recorded in letters, bedtime storytelling to children, notes in family Bibles, talk flowing among the generations through war times and peace, and on to this very day, like the sticky pitch from the plantation's longleaf pines, the stories are hard to shake off. The builder, Colonel James Richardson, descended from my seventh great-grandfather, Amos Richardson, who arrived in New England around 1638. My Aunt Beth recorded in her genealogy book that he was, quote, an attorney for Governor Winthrop, owner of vessels trading in the West Indies, owner of 5,000 acres near Stonington, and a merchant, end quote. He and his descendants were a family name that meant pride, power, patriotism, and American-style nobility. As a child, I was bathed in this family name. My ancestors' ownership of people began with this line in Connecticut by the mid-1600s. When researching for this book, I read Catherine Dupree Lumpkin's The Making of a Southerner. Her sentence, quote, white supremacy, handed down one generation to another, begins with the Southern child before she is conscious of herself as a self. That hit me like a boulder. I learned I have not been immune. It is a bitter thought. So by 1865, 3 generations of Richardsons had lived here. The little box with this newspaper clipping you can't see, but that is about an enslaved woman who died at age 110. It was evidently there from the beginning with Colonel James Richardson and my 4th great-grandmother, and she was there through all of the Richardson generations, and died in 1852, I think it was 55, something like that. The only picture, and this is the only picture of any enslaved person that my ancestors had, is this picture remained in family records, and the young boy's name was Shep Richardson, and he was owned by my 3rd great uncle who had inherited the house and was living there through the Civil War. And I was telling PJ today, another cousin in a different line, we have tried to trace him and can't find anything about him after 1880. So I don't know if he died, I don't know. So here's a little bit I wrote about Shep. Because as everyone knows, so many of the enslaved people, there's no information at all. Apparently this young boy is all I could find in my family, really. Shep of Harmony Hall was born on the edge of slavery, presumably to enslaved people owned by Edmund. At age 3, Shep went, I should say taken, with the Richardsons to Texas after the Civil War. He was a playmate of my 2nd great-granduncle, Edmund, and his wife Sally's youngest sons, James and John, as evidenced in letters that my cousin Liz found among her family's memorabilia. One from James described his favorite boyhood pleasure as, quote, roasting peanuts and potatoes on long winter nights and enjoying the feast with our happy home circle of father, mother, brothers, and Shep. So now, to get a little lighter note, I'm going to, how are we doing on time? PJ's my timekeeper. Oh, good, okay, great. Oh, pretty good. We want to try to end to leave 15, 20 minutes for questions. So my father doesn't really come into the book much because, of course, this was all on my mother's side. My father's side were Mennonites, Quakers, Pennsylvania people. As far as I know, there was no slavery. And some of my happy times were travels with him, and then later you'll hear about travels with my cousin Marion. So this is about going to Pennsylvania with my father. The first time I remember traveling with Papa was to visit his favorite sister, my Aunt Mary, in Washington Borough, Lancaster County. I was 5 years old, If I had to pick one photograph of myself as a child, it would be the one taken on one of these early trips. I'm standing beside my father on a wet winter day, holding my favorite doll. We both look happy. We are on the back stoop of Aunt Mary and Uncle Harvey's house, a favorite sitting spot when the weather was warm. Peas from their backyard were shelled there. Conversation thrived. Water was pumped into the trough that sat on a concrete pad a step down from the porch. I loved to pump the deep water, so cold and delicious. The door behind us leads into the kitchen where my aunt canned produce from her garden, baked mini pies, and made Pennsylvania German dishes. Later, after getting a car and driving, our route took Papa and me across the Susquehanna River. The beautiful old bridge over that broad, rippling river had a nobleness to it. It occurs to me now, as I write these words, that there in Lancaster County I saw majesty. Even if one does not believe in God, I think most people would find they could not keep the phrase God's green earth out of their minds each time they saw the swelling, verdant land, the huge silos, the patches of woods along crystalline creeks, the emerald fields of corn, and especially earth the hue of dark chocolate stirred by a straw-hatted Amish man on a harrow commanding a team of 4 horses. Those were my scenes from my childhood. It was just wonderful. And then we moved to Maine, where I would be with Cousin Marion. At ages 10 and 12, I had 2 of the best summers of my childhood. By then, living in Shaker Heights, Ohio, Marion and her family had settled into a pattern of vacationing on a tiny island off the coast of Maine for a month every summer. The car trips from Cleveland with them were memorable between the absence of parental fights and frequent stops at antique shops. At a restaurant during the first trip, I had my first taste ever of homemade bread. That probably underlays my making most of my bread for the last 50 years. We took the mailboat to the little island and pushed our belongings in a wheelbarrow the half-mile to the cabin. No roads and no electricity made for part of the island's wonderment. Waves broke on beaches, comprised of round pebbles and huge granite boulders. Lobster buoys speckled the waters like multicolored confetti. Abandoned houses dotted the interior. We kids went inside the houses to explore at will and stood in awe at the furniture and books and dishes, left as though people had recently gone on an errand. I could never quite comprehend what force would make families leave so abruptly, especially when leaving meant abandoning their homes and much of the contents. The reason was supposedly that they wanted electricity. I still wonder. Maybe the story is correct. There is still no electricity. For expeditions, we walked the island's circumference, which required a lot of clambering over rocks to avoid getting too wet from breaking waves. The island was only 4 miles around, and there being no way to get lost, we had complete freedom. In the forest, the mosses were fairylands peopled with tiny mushrooms under baby spruce trees. On a sunny day, the taller trees seemed to commandeer shafts of sunlight and beam them into our enchanted woodland. On foggy days, we took to the cabin and played endless games of cards. I have never wanted to return to the little island. Its enchantment stays with me, and I want no reality to change it. Now we turn back to some of the harder parts. That's a picture taken about 1850, an overseer riding past people picking cotton, and I don't know where that was, but it certainly would have looked like South Alabama. This is the last reading, and then we'll have questions. It's a few excerpts from a couple of the ending chapters. And I can't begin this reading without recognizing the recent police killing of Tyree Nichols. I had written the last few chapters in the book right after George Floyd's killing on May 25th, 2020, and don't ask me, well, you could ask me, but it's why it took so long for the book to come out, but I had actually finished the main, almost final draft. And things looked hopeful for a while. Since then, hundreds of black people, mostly men, have been killed by police. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than whites, and black children 6 times more likely. Biden said after Tyree Nichols' killing, quote, "It is yet another painful reminder of the profound fear and trauma, the pain and the exhaustion that black and brown Americans experience every single day." And I have to add, for 400 years, our history has been one of cruelty and depravity against people that white Europeans held in chattel slavery for 250 years. The savagery continues and is still imprinting the soul of our nation. We have so much more work to do. So now I'm going to read a part of a couple of these chapters. I must say something here about researching and reporting the unsavory side of my ancestors and relatives. These ancestors were probably good people in the context of their culture. The complexities are vast. If the dark side of the story had been admired ancestors, of these admired ancestors had been passed down, along with accounts of survival and triumph, would it have made a difference? Would my life have been different? I believe that as a society, we cannot have a dialogue, we cannot move forward if we do not know the full truth. Not knowing is insisting on staying in a state of purposeful ignorance, which only hurts us. We think we know our lives. We don't. There is a vapor, a mist that overhangs. We get surprised. I learned my maternal ancestors' bundle is tied and retied with transgressions, violations, including sexual violations and greed. My forebears' slaveholding, their history seen through today's lens, comprised a greater evil than I ever supposed. Some would say it is not just to view them with the polished magnifying glass of the present, but I must. For my ancestors, it was normal to be an enslaver. Some even thought they were somehow saving the kidnapped Africans from themselves. But the condition of slavery was always evil. Though the ancestor bundle has also tied me in many ways, where I have been able to unknot the binding cords, great gifts presented themselves, many of which I have written about. Moving forward, I recognize my debt to the many hundreds of enslaved people who helped to create the wealth and stature of my ancestors, which has in turn benefited me. I recognize and laud the incredible resilience of these enslaved people and their descendants, and marvel at the degree of forgiveness they have found for the sins against them. Generations below me are showing welcome actions. My grandchildren support social justice with their actions. Portraits and statues and names of white supremacists are literally coming down. Laws and policies are undergoing review, with changes anticipated to establish equity and justice. Recognition of the contributions of the people held in bondage and their forced labor toward the building of this country is starting to happen, along with discussion of reparations. The clarity of what more is needed is coming into focus. In closing, this book is a chronicle of discovery and angst, sorrow and joy, a seeking to comprehend and to mend. We must not forget. Thank you. So now we're, yes. I thought you had a comment or something. You need to say something. Oh. Okay. Do you have a question?
Yeah, you end on an optimistic note. Do you think your book will ever be allowed to appear on a Florida high school?
Not right now. No. Hopefully, hopefully some places. Yeah, I think yes, some places now, and hopefully more places in the future. That's why I said we have a lot of work to do.
Where did the title come from?
Nice question. This book, as you probably all know, was published by the University of Alabama Press, and the working title I had was nothing like this title. It was White Girls Something or Other, Jim Crow. They couldn't figure out a title. Those of you that have never done a book, which I hadn't until this point, you don't get to pick the title. If you self-publish, you pick your title. But if your book is published and you don't get to do anything, you know, the design, the pictures, you know, that's why some people self-publish. I mean, there are other reasons to self-publish too. So they were picking the title and they couldn't come up with a title. And my editor told me that they had never had such a hard time trying to figure out a title for a book. And they had meetings and weren't getting anywhere. So finally I thought, okay, got to do something. And I kind of threw it out to the universe. I said, let me wake up in the morning with some kind of a title. So in the morning, I woke up with the first part, Unloose My Heart. And they liked that. The last part, which is so long and cumbersome, I can't even remember it myself.
It was, and let me sing. And let me sing. Unloose my heart and let me sing, which I like that part. Isn't it really?
Well,
But
yeah,
they didn't, it was too long.
I was not allowed. Thank you. That was the whole title. I wanted Unloose My Heart and Let Me.
Unloose my heart and let me sing.
Yeah. But so that's how. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions, comments, or anything? Yes.
I'm sorry for asking a second one, but PJ, what do you publish in your book?
Well, I like to write music compositions. So I wrote an opera based on poetry that my father did. I come from a musical family, so probably I'm more of a lyricist than a poet. But I do like to write short stories. So something I got to get on, I guess. Sir.
Yes.
I have a question for your cousins. Did you ever envision the possibility that you would meet a white cousin?
Or a black one?
Well, I am a black woman, so I definitely going to meet myself. I guess, and I'm not going to speak for everybody, I'm just going to briefly give my thing, that I would ever meet one. It was more of a question of who did I already meet that might have been related to me. My grandfather was born in 1866. It's not my great-great-great-great-grandfather, even though that doesn't make it any different. You can still be cousins. That was just my grandfather. So I already knew that people were around. I already heard stories that I knew about people that maybe, were not open to that. Which begs the question of other things about how you were received when you're doing your research and bringing this up to people that maybe didn't want to know that. But the Lenoirs can speak for themselves if they wish. Evelyn? Yeah.
Well, we did have my.
Put it up to your mouth or close to the mouth.
We did have my grandfather, Harris Benjamin Silver, who we always thought was white, which was my mother's father. But due to your research, we found out that he was not 100% white. So we always knew that there was some white family members, and we've always prided that our family had an array of colors. Like my mother's half sister had blue eyes and blonde hair, so we knew there was something back there, but because it was before Ancestry.com and everybody moved around the world because of trains and planes, and she's the youngest of 42, so you could imagine her older siblings moved out of the country before she was even born. So just trying to match everybody up, it was very hard, but like I said, we had dinner with Dee Dee, who was blonde hair, blue eyes, and then somebody who had very dark skin was the same family, same sister, mine. So yeah.
If I can just add, along those lines, but more specifically, we were born in Haiti, which is a predominantly black country. And on both sides of our family, and my sister and I, right? And people often ask us, "You're from where?" So my mother being one of 42, we've always viewed it as a genetic experiment, because to see, for instance, 13 of her sisters going from blonde hair, blue eyes to black with blue eyes, it was all over the map. So it was never a question for us. And also on my father's side of the family was also very mixed. So that question was just always so mixed. We always threw it up and said, whatever. One last comment. My mother always told me as growing up, says if you're traveling to the Caribbean, because in the Caribbean, many of her siblings also went on to have 20, 30 kids, which I think is appalling. But she always would tell me, if you're traveling to the Caribbean and you just meet some women, that's just fine. If you're ever thinking of a serious relationship, talk to me, because it's probably your cousin.
Let me make one more comment about that too, just to point out, just from my viewpoint, is the thing is, of course, African Americans that descend from slavery, they all know that they have white ancestry. 25%. I mean, they all know that. They grow up knowing that. Whereas we white people don't, even though if we know there's a history of enslavement in our family, don't consider it necessarily. So it comes as a surprise, whereas for our African American cousins, it's not a surprise at all. But there were, I don't know now, I want to do an order. I think you were next.
So that goes right to the question I was about to ask, which is, it wasn't a great surprise to know more about your DNA and your heritage for the black part of the family.
No, it would not have been at all for them.
But I don't know who is still alive in the past generations of your family. Anybody in the generation above you is still present. What would be, do you imagine, their reaction to this book?
Cousin Marion, because she just was telling me earlier, I had asked her before, because she asked her about, I think the Thomas Jefferson information came out. Yeah. What do you want to say? Do you want to?
I didn't ask my mother because it wasn't a question that needed answering. You know, there was no question. Of course not. I mean, it wasn't worth a question.
Yeah.
But even in her 80s, I think I mentioned to her about, I just sort of threw it out, you know, Thomas Jefferson and
Sally.
Lemony. I said, that never happened. No, that was just a pretend. It was fiction. I mean, it was denial all the way, and I think probably Marcia and Lucy, the two sisters. My mother grew up totally in Florida, South Florida. So, you know, she was just along with the gang in South Florida. And so the division between Marcia's and my generation and our mothers is vast in what has happened since then. And are we lucky it has?
Yes.
It appears, and if I'm making an assumption, please correct me, that your mother and your father were very different people.
Yes.
And how in the world did they get together? And sort of following on that same line, what would be their response to your wonderful work thus far?
Thank you for asking that. That's nice. They were both 36 when they got married. They'd gone through the Depression. My mother was 38 when I was born, and the story I grew up with, she would tell me. She was afraid that she would get too old to have a child. And so she never really loved my father. So she was looking for someone to marry, and he was coming out of, from what I know from letters he saved actually, of a broken relationship. It must have been the love of his life. And you get that age, you think, well, you better get married. So that's how that happened. And I think my father would have been extremely proud of this book, and my mother would not have liked it. John?
The idea that, so I've been doing my genealogy. I have black cousins. And it's estimated that there are about 40 million people who identify as white that have black cousins in the country. Right? So it's not a small number. And what's really interesting is that the black side of the families know this stuff, right? And they know who the father was, and they know who the descendants were, and they know all that. And the white people just sit there and go, oh no, that's impossible. That couldn't have happened. Oh no, Uncle George was such a nice guy. He never would have touched that Sadie, right? I mean, it was just, it's really ridiculous. And to have your effort and the effort of others kind of pulling back the veil of this, I think is very important, because I think once it becomes a little bit more acceptable to look this in the eye, I think it's a great contribution. So thank you for the book.
Thank you for that. Yes.
This is more a statement than a question, Marcia. You know, you've spent a great deal of your life advocating for child sexual abuse victims, and I've always been privileged to know you and be a part of that work. I have to say, this work that you put your heart and soul into it is a testimony, as this man just shared, to pull back the veil of secrecy and of denial that this country suffers from. You know, we're a country that's born out of violence and genocide, and we don't want to face that. And there are so many political efforts underfoot to whitewash that history away as if it never happened. And for you to spend so much time revealing your own family history, which I have to think was a most difficult task for you emotionally, is a great contribution to this effort that we need to make to talk about racism, to talk about slavery and the detriments to our culture and our society that it still holds.
Thank you. Thank you. Just way back there.
Hey, Marcia, were you a little scared at all about what reaction you might get?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I still am. I was telling somebody earlier, I fully expect at some point, I have to say I have not had it yet, except maybe by silence, negative reactions, maybe ugly emails. I mean, who knows? I'm really easy to find on the internet. But so far, so far it's been good. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the part that you refer to in the book, the part in the end around healing. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, like how, at what point, in what way you feel, you know, I can't remember the phrase that you used, but unburdened and, you know, somewhat healed. And I wonder if that was experienced by your cousins also in some way.
Thank you for that question. I think a lot of the healing, of course, it happened over time, and I think the more that I learned, and when I felt like I had a pretty complete picture, although it's only for the ancestors I mentioned in the book, there are so many more, you know, that I saw where there's material out there. There's so much more. I mean, heaven knows what more I would find. I think learning more, then when it becomes like, I know the truth then, it's not mysterious. Sometimes things are worse than you imagine, sometimes they're better than you imagine. I think it gave me some security to have a better idea of exactly what it was, how bad was it, you know, how much was it, and so that knowing was freeing, a bit freeing. And then of course meeting all the cousins and all the adventures along the way. So I think that they want us to finish now. Yeah. Yes. So thank you again, all of you. Oh yeah, so we're supposed to finish. All of you for coming. I mean, it has just been amazing to see all these